When April with his sudden showers has soaked March dryness through and through, and little birds sing songs of joy and wake all night as nature tells them to. When the sap rises into nature's veins so that the sleeping buds begin to swell, and warm winds blowing through the woods and fields tell crops it's time to grow, although they know it well. And when the young sun climbing in the heavens shines with new warmth, then people by the score begin to think once more of pilgrimage, of holy saint and shrine and distant shore. From England's shires they stream to far-off lands, making their way in joyful pilgrim bands.
It's 600 years since Chaucer wrote those lines as he joined his fellow pilgrims on the way to Canterbury. And in those 600 years, the material world has changed almost out of recognition. The bridle paths they travelled are motor roads today, and it's horsepower, not horses, that speeds the pilgrims on their way. And though men and women haven't changed at heart, the way they dress would make Chaucer raise his eyebrows. But in spite of all the changes, the idea of pilgrimage is still alive in people's minds. And more of them come here to Walsingham, a tiny village in the heart of Norfolk. It's a pretty place, the kind of English beauty spot that's on every tourist's map. But the people who come to Walsingham don't come here simply to pass the time and pose for photographs. The shops in the village street aren't typical tourist traps either. In this village, it's easier to buy a crucifix than a packet of cigarettes. For Walsingham is a place of pilgrimage and has been for centuries. It all began just 5 years before the only date that every Englishman can be guaranteed to remember, 1066. For it was in 1061, just 5 years before the Conqueror set sail for England, that the lady of the manor here in Walsingham, her name was Richeldis de Favershey, had a vision. The Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to her and showed her the little house in Nazareth where the angel Gabriel brought his message to Mary and where Jesus grew from a child to a man. Richeldis was told to note its exact dimensions because her task was to build an exact copy of the Holy House in her own village of Walsingham, so that the people of England could find comfort there. Next day, Richeldis called up her men and set them to work. Her carpenters built a wooden house measuring 23 foot 6 inches by 12 foot 10 inches, the measurement she'd been given. All went well until the house was finished. A 14th century ballad tells how the workmen ran into trouble.
For no peace with the other would agree. Then were they all sorry and full of agony, that they could devise neither measure nor mark to join together their own proper work.
But next morning, their problem was solved. The reason for the trouble was that they'd chosen the wrong site. During the night, the little house had been miraculously moved to the place where it ought to have been. Whether or not you believe every detail of the legend, some things are recorded history. The Holy House was founded in 1061, and Richeldis' son Geoffrey gave money and lands to found a religious order to look after it. The documents exist today. The fame of the shrine is a matter of recorded history too. Pilgrims came in their thousands, not as today in the comfort of cars and coaches, but on foot and on horseback, across the winding tracks along the length and breadth of England. From London, they walked the Walsingham Way across the wild heaths of Newmarket and Thetford. From Scotland, they came mile upon mile down through Lincolnshire to the Wash and King's Lynn. And at King's Lynn, they joined the throngs of pilgrims on the quayside who'd come by sea from all over Christendom. A mile from Walsingham, the rich who rode on horseback dismounted. Rich and poor together, they left their shoes in the little slipper chapel and walked barefoot the last mile to the Holy House.
The list of royal pilgrims reads like a roll call of history. Richard I, the Crusader, the Coeur de Lion, was the first English king to come to Walsingham. His successors followed thick on his heels. Henry III, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, Henry VI, Edward IV, Henry VII.
Last of them all came Henry VIII. With an extravagant gesture, he left his horses at East Barsham Manor and walked barefoot not 1 mile but 2 until he reached the shrine. He took with him a collar of rubies from Samarkand for the Virgin statue. He paid for glass to be put in the chapel windows. The scholar Erasmus had complained about the draught. And for the next 11 years, he paid a priest to say mass and kept a candle burning in the shrine.
But Henry's devotion lasted only as long as it suited him. His piety ran out when the church refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and set him free to marry Anne Boleyn. Henry's solution was to declare himself head of the church and force his bishops to ratify the divorce. This solution also, conveniently, gave him possession of all the church lands and treasures in the whole country. The lands were immense, and the shrines were packed with treasures. Walsingham was one of the richest. At the only shrine to rival Walsingham, St. Thomas à Becket's shrine in Canterbury, it took 26 wagons to cart away all the gold and jewels from the shrine. Those who tried to resist got short shrift. Men from Walsingham who planned a protest were arrested for high treason. 10 of them were hung, drawn, and quartered, and the sub-prior of Walsingham was burnt alive.
The prior sold out to the enemy. On the 4th of August, 1538, he used the Great Seal of the Priory for the last time on the document that surrendered it to the king. He collected a handsome pension in return. So the monks dispersed, the land was given to the king's men, the treasures were looted, and the famous statue of Our Lady of Walsingham was taken to London and burnt in the courtyard of Thomas Cromwell's house in Chelsea. Left open to looters and at the mercy of wind and weather, the buildings crumbled. A few years later, they were in ruins. An Elizabethan poet wrote,
"In the wrecks of Walsingham, whom should I choose but the Queen of Walsingham to be my guide and muse? Bitter, bitter, oh, to behold the grass to grow, where the walls of Walsingham so stately did show. Level, level with the ground the towers do lie, which with their golden glittering tops pierced once to the sky. Where were gates, no gates are now, the ways unknown, where the press of friars did pass while her fame was far blown. Sin is where Our Lady sat, heaven turned to hell. Satan sits where our Lord did sway. Walsingham, farewell.
So for another 400 years, Walsingham was forgotten. Pigeons built in the ruined towers, and the ancient stones were carted away to build walls and cowsheds and pigsties. And the old slipper chapel was turned first into a barn and then a cowshed. But at the beginning of this century, new life began to stir in Walsingham. First, the disgraced slipper chapel was bought, so that it could be turned back into a Roman Catholic church. And then in 1921, Walsingham Parish Church had a new vicar, Alfred Hope Patton, a man who loved Walsingham and everything it stood for. Within 10 years, he had once more built a replica of the Holy House to the same dimensions that Richeldis had been given. A new Anglican shrine to Our Lady of Walsingham was opened in 1931. 3 years later, the Roman Catholic slipper chapel was reconsecrated. With Hitler's war a few years off, it might have seemed an ill-timed gesture. The revival of an old idea of pilgrimage at a time when the modern world and material values were beginning to get an iron grip on what was left of men's souls. But as things turned out, the reverse has proved true. Year by year, pilgrims come in their thousands. This is Walsingham at Whitsun, at one of the Anglican national pilgrimages. Numbers are down this year, say the regulars, because of heavy rain. But more than 10,000 people braved the downpour. The statue of Our Lady of Walsingham is taken from the shrine and carried in procession through the streets. The statue was copied from the Great Seal of the old priory, the only record of how the original statue must have looked. Here in the Abbey grounds, a single towering arch of the east window shows the scale of Walsingham's former glory. They stand to take communion in the open air. So many of them that even the old abbey would be too small to hold them all. Afterwards, they walk in joyful procession through the village street, singing hymns. And in these days of tension, whenever crowds gather, there's surely a lesson to be learnt from the sight of Walsingham's solitary Bobby shepherding single-handed through the streets, a mob as oddly dressed in their own way as any cup final crowd. Anglican bishops lead the way, and behind them come priests of the Greek Orthodox Church, followed by their own bishops. Everywhere there are banners, and if some of them are more concerned with man's sin than God's glory, where but at Walsingham are shouts of protest drowned by the cheerful singing of hymns. Walsingham manages somehow to pull the sacred and the secular together, recalling days when every holiday was just that, a holy day. An opportunity to relax, to celebrate, and to greet your friends. Just how many pilgrims come to Walsingham every year? We asked the two people most closely involved, Father Christopher Colvin of the Anglican Shrine and his Roman Catholic counterpart, Father Clive Birch.
Well, it's always difficult to estimate. We can say how many people have actually told us that they're coming, but we could say that there's something like 250,000 people who pass through Walsingham as tourists, as pilgrims, or, you know, one way or another.
It's easy to count numbers, but it's much harder to decide why people come. Do you know why they come, Father Christopher?
A lot of them come because they're on a coach tour from Sheringham or Cromer and don't really know what they've come to. I think it's a mystery tour for some of them. But I do believe that all those who come to Walsingham, no matter what their motive might be, do absorb something of the place.
And what is the essence of the place? Can you answer that?
I think you'd have to say atmosphere.
Yes.
An atmosphere is a terribly hard thing to define. You sense it or you don't. And certainly the hundreds, thousands of people who we deal with every year, large numbers of them do experience something here. They feel a presence about the place.
Yes.
It is a different village from all those around it.
Well, I must say I find that myself. But is this caused by the centuries of prayer, do you think? Do places soak up prayer?
Well, it seems to me that the original inspiration of Walsingham seems to have come in some way or another from Our Lady. And she said, she's reputed to have said anyway at that time, whoever comes to my shrine will find succor, comfort and help. And it seems that people come here and really do experience that.
Yes, I think the message of Walsingham is essentially about home life. Our Lady asked in her original vision that a house should be built, a simple house, where the people of England could come to reflect upon those early years of Jesus' life. And therefore it is those simple virtues of security and peace, of prayer, of a right respect for the things of God, a right respect for each other, which are emphasised here. It's something very hidden and very quiet, but I think it's something that people recognise when they come, and they sense it, they feel it.
You see, there are many shrines throughout the world to Our Lady, and each one of them has its own inspiration, its own message. But here in Walsingham, called England's Nazareth, we have a particular aspect of the mystery of our salvation remembered here, and that is the humanity of Christ, the incarnation of the Son of God. We remember in Nazareth the 30 years in obscurity of Jesus. Jesus, Mary and Joseph living as an ordinary family.
I was going to take up the word ordinary that you used. I think the wonderful thing about Walsingham is that it's not for any particular type of person. There's no special kind, there's no special mould that people fit into. It's essentially ordinary people, ordinary families, very humdrum people who come with their ordinary concerns.
Yes, I've noticed on the pilgrimages that there are people having picnics all over the Abbey grounds and children. It does seem to be a wonderful family day out, I've always thought.
Oh yes, I mean if you go back to the medieval pilgrimage into Chaucer,
yes,
you see there, it was great fun.
Religion was fun then, wasn't it? It wasn't shut away.
Walsingham was a very happy place.
Yes, I certainly do feel that when I come myself. But when the pilgrims come, what do they talk to you afterwards? Do they...
Incessantly.
This is true. Not a moment's peace.
Really?
I think that although we're told we live in a secularised and an indifferent society, there are certainly many, many people who do want the things of God and who have lots of problems within themselves that they want to bring here and they want to have drawn out.
Yes.
I know that we find here at the Anglican Shrine that it's the confessionals, especially on a Saturday in the main part of the pilgrimage, which are very, very busy.
It's the same experience that we have in our shrine too. The new chapel that we're building, for example, has got 4 more confessionals, you know.
Confession's rather gone out in the Church of England. Do you think it's going to come back?
Going to confession is something which has always been part of the Church of England, in its official form it is. But as you say, in practice it hasn't been widespread. But I think increasingly people are realising that this is a way in which they can come close to our Lord, in which they can experience his forgiveness.
It seems to me, in fact, that the psychiatrists took over when the confessional went out.
I was talking to a psychiatrist recently who was really rather resentful. She'd spent several years with a man working him through all his problems. And then at the end, when she thought she'd finally got there, he said, "Thank you very much, now I must go to a priest and get absolution."
Thousands of pilgrims walk the Holy Mile each year. This pilgrimage was to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Union of Catholic Mothers. The former village bobby, now retired, steps out in front with his successor. They walk the Holy Mile in the sunshine, and they walk it in the rain. The processions wind their way along this narrow Norfolk lane, making their way towards the little Slipper Chapel. Next door to the Slipper Chapel is the new Chapel of Reconciliation, its red roof towering above the Norfolk fields, like a great barn built to gather in a harvest of souls. It was completed in 1982, and it holds 500 people. There's room for even more in the gardens outside the chapel, and the altar can be opened up so it can be used from this side too. Cardinal Hume blessed the chapel when it was opened, and here at the Catholic Mother's Mass, he blesses a new statue.
And it's also a day when we make that act of faith in the fact that she is truly our mother, and recall that wonderful moment when our Lord, dying on the cross, turned to St. John and said, "Son, behold thy mother." And to Mary he said, "Woman, behold thy son." At that moment, she became the mother of all to be redeemed by her son. Your mother and my mother. That's why Walsingham is important.
Not all the pilgrimages are big ones. Small groups come to Walsingham almost every day. And in twos and threes, people come to make their own private pilgrimages, walking the Holy Mile barefoot. They bring their griefs and sorrows to this place, a place where sorrow is understood, where prayers are heard, and grief is comforted.
It is Mary who will teach us how to be silent, how to listen for the voice of God in the midst of a busy and noisy world. It is Mary who will help us to find time for prayer. The faithful for centuries have made pilgrimage to her shrine at Walsingham.
Back in the village of Walsingham itself, there's another modern Roman Catholic church, and almost next door to it is the Methodist chapel. Wesley himself came to preach at Walsingham and lamented the abbey's decay. And round the next corner, a Russian Orthodox church, complete with gilded dome, flourishes in what was once an LNER railway station. All kinds of Christians find a place to pray in Walsingham, and there's a spirit in the place that makes all the differences between them seem somehow less important than all the things they share. Inside the Anglican shrine, there's a constant stream of pilgrims coming and going. And here in the Holy House, a simple pitch roof building with stones from ancient abbeys built into its walls, Mass is celebrated every day. We asked one of the nuns who helps look after the shrine what makes the Holy House a special place.
a marvellous atmosphere in the Holy House of prayer.
As though it sort of soaked
yes,
it up.
Yes, oh, definitely.
That is amazing, isn't
and
it?
it's amazing. I had a man came in the shrine one evening, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he said, well, I just had to come back and say thank you. He said, I was healed of cancer here. And I blurted out, gosh, this place works then. I couldn't help it, you know.
Really?
Oh, it's really marvellous.
Yes.
Oh, you know, it's a real thrill for when people come to the shrine and tell you things like that. It's really marvellous.
But do you find there's any, living in Walsingham without the pilgrims here, do you find when people shed their burdens, they leave their burdens behind them at all? Or?
Oh yes, people tend to think that it's a really tranquil place, and I suppose it is for the weekend or week that you're here.
Yeah.
You know, but I think you have to live in Walsingham to get to know it, and it can have its...
You mean all
you know,
the sort of
it's as if
burdens
Satan works overtime here because it's highly concentrated Christian place. He would have to work overtime.
He really would,
here.
yes, otherwise things would get too good.
And I suppose it's a good thing in a way, because if the devil's working like mad, then this place must be doing something good somewhere.
Yes.
Otherwise he wouldn't bother, would he?
I always reckon if somebody fights you, you'll know you're doing
By
a good
gum,
job,
yes.
don't you?
Cut that.
Here we are, about to leave Walsingham, with most of our questions still not tidily answered. But one fact is inescapable. Thousands of people come here every year, and they find what they're looking for. They don't come here demanding answers. They don't come to report back, to investigate, to check up. They're here to kneel where prayer has been valid. They come to Walsingham because here the holy and the homely meet, and the world is made whole. At the heart of Walsingham is the solemn mystery of the Incarnation, and at the heart of Walsingham too is the fun, the fellowship, the family day out. The modern theologian Michel Coist wrote,
I would understand that nothing is secular, neither things, nor people, nor events, but that, on the contrary, everything has been made sacred by its origin in God, and that everything must be consecrated by man,
and made divine.
That's why Walsingham is important.
Mm-hmm.